Russell, a few weeks ago, can you remember we put out a cry for other podcasts to get in touch for us to sort of advertise?
For cross-promotional purposes, yes.
Yes.
As we speak across each other.
Yes. Well, I reached out to a podcast that I actually listen to called Car Journey Conversations, and they agreed. They've put a little advert out for us.
Indeed they did, which was very kind of them. We now have a little advert from them to play.
Hi, this is Catherine.
And this is Shane on Car Journey Conversations.
Come and join us on our weekly podcast as we discuss topics inspired by conversations in the car.
Is being introverted really a bad thing?
Have you ever had a lucid dream?
Or discover if humans are being replaced by robots?
Visit us at www.carjourneyconversations.com and let's take you on the journey with us.
Hello, my name's David.
And I'm Russell.
And this is Old News.
It's good to be back.
We're finally back.
Finally back after another pause in production.
A hiatus.
A hiatus. That's a type of hernia, isn't it? Yeah, I guess it's... Why did you have the disgusted face there? Yeah? Life gets in the way, doesn't it, occasionally?
Mm-hmm.
These things happen, so it's been a very busy period and things have happened in our lives, whatever. How are you generally? Are you okay, in good health?
I'm alright at the moment, yes.
You're alright?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm full of busy getting prepared for an upcoming trip to Canada, but we'll talk about that more in the next episode, I imagine. Yeah, I've also been having adventures in the history of UK telephony.
Yeah, that was a weird Facebook status this morning.
So, for those of you that don't follow me on Facebook, which you clearly all should, I remembered very clearly from a kids' TV show, one of the Saturday morning kids' TV shows, the telephone number that they used to get people to call into the show, and these numbers have evolved over time where they've changed the codes and reorganised things down in London. And I thought, what happens if you just update that number? And I called it out of sheer curiosity. I called the number with the updated telephone code. I discovered I didn't get through to the BBC. It's an unused number that is for sale commercially.
Which is a shame. I suggested we buy it for Old News, but it is a London number.
There is a certain kudos, isn't there? Because even though London is now... I'm going to bore people with telephone codes now. London is now 020 is the code, isn't it? But you've still got this inheritance from numbers that lead with an 8 as being the centre of London, and that is still considered quite prestigious.
Old News.
I was quite taken by the chaps there from Car Journey Conversations. They're talking about whether robots will take over our jobs, and have you seen in the news today?
Well, to be fair, they did say, are robots taking over humans?
Well,
which is slightly different to
that's true,
are robots taking over human jobs.
Well, this is the thing. Have you seen the news today about the artificial intelligence that Facebook had? They had various bots. I've just sort of read the headlines really, but they had bots that were communicating with each other.
Right.
And although they were instructed to speak in English, in order to get around the rules, they started speaking in their own language that they couldn't understand.
Oh, okay.
They developed their own language, and so they had to pull the plug.
So they broke their programming. Their programming said you have to speak in English.
They didn't break their programming as such, because I don't think they had strictly injuncted them to speak in English as such. But they were getting them to negotiate.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously a way of kind of excluding people from negotiations is to speak in code or develop another language that like a third person would remain ignorant of.
Right.
Yeah, so apparently they've also developed all kinds of really sneaky ways of negotiating, so they'll feign interest in some item in a negotiation. They'll pretend to be interested and then at a later point discard this thing that they're pretending to be interested about because that looks like a concession.
Right.
Which is
something humans do all the time, but it's a bit scary that computers would do it.
It's kind of worrying, isn't it? Yeah. We're all going to be disposed of before long, aren't we?
Old News.
We were building a shed on Saturday, weren't we?
We were building a shed. Shed erection. the disapproving look. Yeah. A friend who has an allotment had a shed which had been dismantled from his own garden and had been moved to the allotment and then needed to be reassembled.
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing. Why you only get dismantled, but you don't get mantled or remantled? You get reassembled or disassembled or assembled.
But you don't get mantled.
Curious etymology question, which I suppose we could look up on the internet and solve in 10 seconds.
But we won't because we're too busy talking.
But typically, wasn't it, we were like trying to handle these enormous big wood panels and the wind decided to blow, but it all went okay in the end.
It did, yeah. I was surprised how easy it was. Although I've got to say, I wasn't stiff at all from all the work we did yesterday. But today, my legs have been stiffer than some of the wood we were moving around.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I got terrible sunburn. That was the price I paid.
Old news.
Right. Shall we start today's topic?
Yes, I'll just rearrange my paper notes and my beer of indeterminate strength, which is today described as bitter.
Be interesting to see if the listeners could hear me walking out the room there. Yeah, I have something that it wasn't labelled. The box it came out of was specifically unlabelled. I think it's an amber ale. It's quite nice.
Well, I can say that the bitter definitely tastes bitter.
Possibly the least successful.
It's alright. It's fine. It's not the best, but it's alright.
One.
At least it doesn't taste of... What was that cider you made that tasted savoury?
That was the pineapple cider.
Pineapple cider. Yeah, it isn't like that.
No.
Let's talk about today's topic. So, the opening of the Channel Tunnel, which was, to quote to date, the official opening where the Queen and President Francois Mitterand did the business, was the 6th of May 1994. This time around, when I generally sort of looked at kind of just like internet articles and whatever's around, but I decided to just mainly look at a lot of YouTube videos, because I thought, let's try and go back to some of the news coverage as it was. The main ones I looked at were the BBC and the bit of ITN, which is the Independent Television News, and also the Associated Press as well. And then I actually looked at a couple of French news.
Okay.
Right, and I don't speak French. I am a monoglot, unfortunately, with the smattering of schoolboy French that I retain, after X many years of having left for school. Obviously, because I just watched the English language videos of the same thing, so you get a sense of exactly what's being said. It was quite interesting to see how that plan sort of panned out. So you've got the brand new tunnel it still wasn't fully commissioned at this point, and it's running from Folkestone to Calais. I was going to say, is it the Pas de Calais?
Yeah,
in France. And you've got the two services were showcased that day. You've got the Eurostar, which is the passenger service, and the Le Shuttle, which is the drive on. Yeah,
drive on, drive off.
Drive off service, yeah. And so what happened was President Mitterand of France set off from Paris down the high speed line to Calais, and then the Queen set off from Folkestone, and they came through the tunnel and they met in Calais. And then they got into the Queen's Rolls Royce and then headed back on the shuttle to the British side. I thought it was quite interesting to note some of the little things which were sort of curious on the day. So the French had actually built the high-speed line from Paris to Calais, to the tunnel mouth. And that train was delayed. It was late. It was slow to get to Calais.
Oh, God.
But they slowed everything down and they met. They actually, in a kind of one-off, they would never do it in reality, they actually brought two trains on the same line, nose to nose. Yeah, with a French flag on one and a British flag on the other, and they crept up and stopped, and then there was a red carpet sort of between the two. So they were 5 minutes late, but it was all fine. It was fine. They rejigged it all. But it was really interesting to sort of get a sense of the emphasis between the two news coverages of the story. On the British side, this train was late. This project is a year delayed from being opened. And also, what's the other negative thing they came out with? Was obviously the finances. Yeah, the finances that it overran.
Right.
And so, despite the fact, great celebration of this big achievement, and it was a huge achievement for French and British engineering and the construction industry, the civil engineering industry, that the British media couldn't help themselves.
Yeah, they had to find the negative side of it.
Yeah, and they found all three negative things they could say. Let's embarrass them on the day, let's say something negative about the circumstances, and then let's downplay ourselves. Whereas, by what I could tell from the French, it was much more upbeat. What a great success for France. And of course the ceremony, the cutting of the ribbon, was on the French side, and they were listing all the other people that were there. There was also the Belgian Prime Minister at the time, and also the President of the what was at that point the European Community Commission, Jacques Delors, was also there as well. So it was really interesting to see this contrast of the two. How clearly do you remember this event?
I don't remember the opening. I remember the building of it, the announcement that they were going to build it. I remember being around when it opened and seeing pictures of the different trains that were going to go through it and all that sort of thing. I don't remember the opening ceremony in any way, shape or form.
There's this terrible culture we have of we think everything we do is rubbish in this country.
Yeah.
We often find it very hard to celebrate our successes.
And we complain about countries that do celebrate their successes.
Yeah. Like who?
Like the Americans.
Yeah, and who else next door?
And the French.
Yeah, and particularly things like railways, which is what this is, There's an interesting sort of mirror image there.
Old news.
If you'd like to get in touch with us, go to our website, www.oldnews.podbean.com, or you can email us, oldnews@gmail.com. You can visit us on Facebook, just search for Old News Podcast, or connect to us through Twitter @OldNewsPod. We're also on YouTube.
Margaret Thatcher is a very sort of important key figure in this, because this idea of a tunnel has been around since
Victorian times.
Yeah, well, if not earlier, actually, doesn't the first one get kiboshed because of the Napoleonic Wars? They do start to dig it because they're planning on putting horse and carts through it. Are they like stagecoaches? And then it gets stopped because there's a fear of an invasion from France through the tunnel,
which is a fear that still existed when we did build the tunnel.
Yeah.
Oh well, people could invade through the tunnel.
Surely you just employ a man with a spear to stand at one end and go back.
Just some pikemen.
It's the most easily defensible position, isn't it?
You just collapse it.
Yeah.
Really, you don't even need a man with a spear.
Just throw a water balloon in there and give them a surprise, and people will run away. It's just crazy, right? This speaks to our island mentality, doesn't it? Really,
it does, yeah.
The opposition to this, and there was the earlier effort in the 70s where that was a very serious effort where they tried to bore. It was just a single tube tunnel, but that only got so far, and the money ran out.
Right.
That was a private venture. But the workings for that were then subsequently reused in the construction.
Oh, I didn't know that in the new one.
The new one. I think it was used for like a service tunnel and things. It still doesn't form part of the main construction, but in the kind of the building, those works were used. But that's really important because she is surprisingly friendly with Francois Mitterand, who is a socialist. This has always been one of these kind of strange things in politics of that era, that those two managed to have a very good working relationship. I think the French were very keen that the project would finally go ahead, but she insisted it be built with private money, which obviously put the nose out of joint of the old nationalised British Rail, which I think would have dearly loved to have had that. I mean, how do you feel about that? Do you think these things should be state projects?
Well, can I be somewhere in between on this one?
Okay.
I think if something can be funded privately, there's no reason why it shouldn't be. Or if it can be partly funded privately, there's no reason why it shouldn't be. But I do think if there's high risk of failure, I suppose with this it perhaps was too big to be funded privately and expected to then make a profit.
Because
I also have
go on.
infrastructure projects. It's in the country's interest.
Yeah, they're national assets, aren't they?
That's right. Surely the country should be paying towards something that's in the country's interest.
See, this is the thing, isn't it? Because in the UK we have one motorway that is fully privately funded, privately owned and privately operated with tolls. Well, we just have that one motorway, which is the M6 toll.
Yeah.
For anybody in the UK will know. That is vastly underused.
Yeah.
So now we've got a big sort of strategic asset that's underused, but it's underused because it's expected to pay, because it has a private owner. So really the argument might be then we should just nationalise it. They raised the funds through sales of shares and bank investments, whatever, in 1987 for the construction. And then in 1995 it really hit the wall financially, so that was only a year after it opened.
Yeah, I remember that happening.
Remember that, yeah. And there was this absolutely fantastic quote, which I always remember being on the news, and it was the guy who was the chairman of Eurotunnel at the time was British, and he went out. There'd been a big all-night negotiation with the banks, and they'd come to a deal. They'd rescheduled all of the debt, and he went out and said, if you owe the bank £3 million, that's your problem. If you owe the bank £3 billion, that's the bank's problem.
Yeah, yeah.
Which once you owe that amount of money, you basically are the bank. The bank can't let you go bust because the bank ceases to exist. Interestingly, in that 20th anniversary or whatever it was, they were saying that the first profitable year of operation of the tunnel was 2007.
Right. When did it open again?
1994.
Right.
It's just astonishing, isn't
Yeah.
it? The private banks and private investors shouldered that burden for so long before they got any sort of return. But it's an interesting what if. Had it collapsed financially, we would probably have had to nationalise it anyway.
Yeah, we would have had to.
Yeah, because what else would we do? It would be too embarrassing. We couldn't just board it up.
Yeah. Just let the rats go back and forth.
Or even, I suppose, given the government of the day, we might very well have refused to do anything, and then the French would have nationalised the whole thing, and they would have owned it 100%.
Yes.
That's what would have happened.
It charged British people to go through it, but not French people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So one of the other things I wanted to talk about when this thing opened, and I quite remember it when it happened, was we have a TV show in the UK called Have I Got News for You? Which is a very popular satirical news show, and they have an animated opening sequence.
Yes.
That, yeah. Over the years, it changes because it always reflects.
Yeah, what's going on in the news?
What's going on in the news that year or that 6-month period or whatever. And I always remember there was an animation in that of a
Eurostar train.
Yeah, a Eurostar train coming out of the tunnel on the British side, and then it being hauled by horses. Yeah, and this is a reference to the fact that we in Britain didn't bother to build a rail link from the tunnel head into the centre of London. This reflects what's happening with the high-speed rail project we have at the moment, because basically it's held up by the landowners in Kent, the big, powerful landowners. These are people who are members of the House of Lords, the rich commuter, what do you call them, the city.
Right,
which is the commuter belt for the city and so on, and they didn't want this filthy, stinking railway coming through their
estates.
Their estates, yeah. Where we go shooting at the weekends and all of this. Because what happens is they end up running the trains on the existing track. Instead of having the nice overhead 25,000 volts, so high-powered system, we had to run the trains on the third rail commuter network at 750 volts. It's just terrible. I think the maximum speed it could do was like 85 miles an hour.
Yeah, something like that, I remember.
It's terrible. Yeah. I've only been through the tunnel once, and I travelled on it in that era before the new line was built. And it was funny, you kind of clunked and clunked and clunked along this terrible commuter track. Like, although the train was this really fabulous bit of engineering, you were clunking along this track, and then the moment you went through the tunnel, you could actually feel the train accelerate.
Yeah. And
the maximum speed through the tunnel is like 100 and odd, and you could actually feel the train accelerate as they put their foot down. Well, presumably trains don't have pedals, right? But they
move the hand forward.
And then as you came out of the tunnel, you then went full speed. You were going 140 miles an hour, if not more, whatever it is, and just straight into the centre of Paris didn't slow down until like the last sort of moment.
Yeah.
Really. Yeah. But eventually, when we build the Channel Tunnel rail link, they changed the name to HS1, High Speed 1. The idea being that this would be the first one, and then there'd be an HS2, which is what we're going to build now. But everybody goes, oh, the HS2 project is terrible, it's rubbish.
Yeah. It's too expensive.
Yeah.
I'll not move out of my house.
Well, it's become massively expensive, largely because we're having to sink a load of it into tunnels.
Yeah.
And guess who's forced that?
It's the landowners.
The landowners, the big, rich, powerful landowners, standing in the way of progress.
Yeah.
This is the one thing I really admire about the French, and I think this must come from the inheritance from the French Revolution. You know what I mean? The state will just do as the state does.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the hell with you aristocrat in the way. You've got a chateau there. No, we're running a railway line through. Terribly sorry about the chateau. Actually, not sorry at all.
Yeah.
Just get your chateau out of the way of my railway line. And I'm not saying that we should be so heavy-handed, but at least the French didn't have the embarrassment of connecting horses up to the front of the train in 1994.
Old news.
I want to talk about trains because I like talking about trains.
Yeah, you are Sheldon, basically.
I'm not Sheldon, and I'm not.
Bazinga.
I'm not a train spotter, but I'm not ashamed to say I quite like trains. So I mean, the very famous trains you always see pictures of is the Eurostar trains, which are the Class 373 under the British system. The French call them the TGV TMST. Now, schoolboy French.
TGV
is. I'll give you T is
Grand Vitesse.
Yeah, high speed. Right, in TMST, TM.
So this has got to be something to do with under the sea. So, what was it?
TM.
Something with Transmanche.
That's what they call the channel, isn't it? Transmanche, and ST is Super Train.
Really?
Yeah.
Super Train.
Yeah, so I like that. That greatly amused me. But one of the things I want to talk about, because they build these things, and they are fabulous bits of gear when they're built. But because they have to run in the UK, and at the time on the stupid commuter lines with the third rail, they also have to have the proper overhead system, where they also have to run on the Belgian railways because there's a connection up to Brussels as well, and they have overhead wires but at a different voltage.
Okay, yeah.
And so these things are built with 3 sets of gear in them. Since we built our high speed line, they got rid of the third rail stuff, right. So that was all stripped out. But one of the things I thought I'd mention about this, they're now being replaced by a new version, and it's the 374. Interesting that the original ones is an enormous set of carriages with locomotives either end, and in some ways that's quite old-fashioned thinking. And the new ones are more where they have the electric motors mounted throughout the train.
Oh, in the carriages themselves.
In the carriages themselves, which
right.
is very much the practice of the modern TGV system in France, but also originally from Japan.
Right.
The bullet trains. Yeah, that technology starts in the 60s. One of these locomotives, the 373s, is now actually in the main hall of the National Railway Museum.
Right.
So I was there just recently with a friend, and I was thinking, I feel really old.
Yeah, this feels like a new train.
Yeah.
But it's in a museum.
It's in a museum, yeah. There was a whole load of those trains built, but there was also 7 entire sets of those trains built for what was called the North of London regional service.
Yeah.
And these things, it was the total financial basket case.
Night Star, it was called.
Well, there was Night Star, wasn't it? Because they were going to start on the East Coast, Edinburgh.
Yeah, going to start at Edinburgh, stop at Newcastle.
Because they used to have the signage on the station.
Yeah, I was really excited about it.
Yeah.
I thought that'll be cool, getting on the train at Newcastle and waking up in the morning in Paris.
Yeah, go all the way down here. And then I think the other ones were going to run from Glasgow, weren't they?
Down the west coast.
Down the west coast, and then through London and on to Paris. And there was just no demand for it. It just collapsed straight away. The thing that really killed it was budget airlines.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
It was
both starting up at about the same time.
Yeah, the late 90s, early 2000s, and it just would never work. And in fact, at a later date, they did actually use some of those trains very briefly on the East Coast Main Line when they were short of trains. And I think they could only run them as far as Leeds because the curves up at Newcastle are too
curvy,
too tight. Yeah.
Okay.
So it would have cost fortunes to adapt everything to allow them to run anyway. So there was this. I mean,
hang on a second. I just want to think about the logic about that. These trains were originally going to run from Edinburgh to Paris, but when they were running them on the East Coast Main Line, but when they were running them as East Coast Main Line trains, they couldn't run them.
Yeah.
How does that work?
They were planning on doing track works as well.
Oh, right, okay.
So that this is one of the things that really kills it as a project, because they've spent fortunes on the trains. They're then going to have to spend fortunes on track modifications and works through stations like Newcastle and some of the places to the north to get to Edinburgh. And the cost of that was so enormous,
right,
that it just didn't add up, and so you're left with this ghost fleet of trains, which, and you were just saying they were then sold
to Canada, sold to was it CN?
No, it was sold.
Or was it the other one?
Via Rail,
yeah.
Which is the passenger railway in the long distance passenger railway. But that wasn't a huge success in the end.
No, they weren't suitable. As you can imagine, a train designed by Frenchmen to run in France and England didn't quite work in the harsh environment of the Canadian winter.
Well, you'd think, something that was built as a joint British-French project, would work in Canada. Really?
You're going to go down that road. There's so many things wrong with that.
I like the way I'm conceptualising Canada as a joint British-French project. Yeah, I mean, I think they had problems with things like the pipework for the toilets freezing in the winters, and I don't think they bought the locomotives. They bought the rolling stock, the actual carriages, and so Via Rail ended up spending quite a lot of money adapting these things, and it was a bit of a financial disaster for Via Rail. So these things caused two financial disasters in their lives, and I think their lives have been surprisingly short in Canada. It's a shame that night services like that died the death. And yet actually apparently in the UK now we have 2 night services left. We have the one down London to Cornwall, and there's one from London to the very north of Scotland, and they've spent quite a lot of money on them in recent times, and passenger ridership's growing. People prefer to use them rather than take sort of internal flights and things.
Yeah, I think if you sell them in the right way, it's all about marketing. It's all about marketing. Put it in people's faces so they know it exists, and show them how comfortable it is.
But I think this is a classic case of where something just comes along in the wrong era. It is just marketing. You are right. Although night services in Europe are generally on the decline, which is a shame. So we're bucking the trend in a way. I threatened for a long time to do the Paris-Berlin overnight service, and that no longer exists. And that was one of the oldest ones as well, which is a real shame. Yeah, so the north of London regional Eurostar, Nightstar service, whatever it was going to be called, didn't come to fruition.
Out news!
If that didn't work, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the things that the tunnel killed and didn't kill.
Okay.
Right? Because there was some thought that because you've not only got the passenger service and the kind of the car service, you also got the trucks as well, and you also got freight, so you got the 4 services running through, and they thought that basically this would kill the
ferries.
The ferries, yeah. And of course it doesn't. I mean, the ferry companies are still very much alive and kicking and doing very well for themselves, thank you very much. The things that don't survive is, and they've come and gone, one is train ferries. And I think people forget that they existed.
I only know that they existed because I had a picture book with one in.
Right.
Might still be on my bookshelf somewhere. I'm looking. It was like, the big book of trains or something like that.
Right.
And it was this picture of a ship with loads of train lines kind of going through it.
Yeah. And there was a cross-channel train ferry service. And I think because British Rail had their nose put out of joint that they didn't get the project as such, they continued to try to run that, and after a year it just went. It had ceased to exist. Interestingly, there was 2 other options which were like directly in competition. There was high-speed ships. They came along in the late 90s, and obviously there was the hovercraft service was still on the go as well.
Yeah.
And both of those continue to operate in competition with the tunnel, despite the fact they offered similar times. But the thing that kills them ultimately is the loss of duty-free.
Yeah.
Because I don't think they were ever really economic without having the duty-free shop on board. So yeah, it's interesting that the people that do survive are the budget airlines and the existing conventional ferries, which I think nicely sort of leads to kind of one of the last points on the actual tunnel I wanted to make about freight, because this was just in the news. They planned originally to run 35 trains a day of freight, and they were hoping to move 10 million tons of freight a year. Last year, they carried 1 million tons.
Really?
Yeah.
That's rubbish.
Yeah, really terrible. And they were talking about, apparently the peak was 1997 at 3 million tons of freight.
Really?
So this really hasn't been a success. And then is it Wealdstone in North London? Is that how it's pronounced? Wealdstone? There's a big freight yard there with, you know, the big cranes over the sidings, you know, for taking containers on and off, and intermodal is the word. Yeah, and that's all abandoned, shut.
Right.
So it's really interesting that, because there was a good article in Londonist, if anybody wants to go have a look at that, and they were saying that the things that killed that was obviously the migrants problem.
Right.
Migrants desperately trying to get through the tunnel, and so more and more inspections of containers and things, which were delaying things. And of course, when things got delayed and the tunnel got shut and freight couldn't get through, then they just went to the ferries, which were reliable.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I hadn't thought about this, is that the manufacturing base in Europe changed when the European Union expanded. An awful lot of manufacturing moved east, and their railway network is much less developed, basically because of the Second World War and the Russians saying, we'll go take your railway. And so if you move your factory to the east, you then just put it onto trucks, and then you just move it by truck across Europe anyway. So that traffic sort of disappeared. And the third option apparently was because, and surprise, surprise, is because our railway being 150 years old, can't really accept standard size shipping containers.
Oh, there's a surprise.
Yeah, it's a thing called the loading gauge, which is like the actual width of the train, not the width of the track, but the width of the size of the carriage, if you want. It's a great shame that something that could be really good for the environment, you know, getting freight off the roads and whatever, really hasn't worked. So despite the fact the tunnel is successful and profitable, that's one aspect that really did fail.
Of course, there's the Chinese train that's going to go through it.
It's not the same train though, is it? It's...
They have to change it several times because of the different gauges on the route. I mean, that's a very long way from far end of China to London, and there's the ex-Soviet states who have a different gauge to everyone else.
The Russian gauge.
Then you hit Eastern Europe, then you hit Western Europe.
It's interesting though, I remember reading, it was the book of a TV series. Channel 4 did a program in the 90s called Locomotion. It was like the history of the railways, and there was a bit in that about the future of the railway, and they were saying that once the tunnel was opened, you'd be able to go continuously on rails from Edinburgh to Shanghai. Be interesting to see whether that grows. But I suppose that this,
to me, it does smack of just a propaganda thing. You know what I mean? Of how much commercial relevance is a few trains. If they were running a lot, yes, running a few trains back and forth.
Well, I think there's two elements to this. The vast majority of that freight runs on ships around the Chinese coast and then up through the Indian Ocean and through Suez into southern Europe. They're looking at the overland option because they think that Suez might not be reliable given the political instability.
Okay.
So I think that's part of what they're thinking about. But the other part is because the Chinese are looking very strongly to re-establish the traditional Silk Road route.
Yeah.
But that's about the internal development of like sort of inland China.
Okay. So you're running trains through inland China.
Yeah. And
that's going to bring a bit of money, bit of development.
If you start to develop like a manufacturing base
along that route, along that corridor.
And it makes sense for them projecting their power into the countries that border.
Yeah. Turkmenistan
and all Central Asia,
places.
And it's that sort of power play between Russia and China in Central Asia. So interesting how talking about the Channel Tunnel has taken us all the way to Beijing.
Yeah, but somehow managed to get into Turkmenistan. How's that happened?
Well, I think that says something about the power of railways to still be relevant. and connect us in a really important way, like even now.
And that was the message from the Railway Marketing Board.
Marketing boards.
Oldeth, newseth.
There has been talk over time of building a tunnel to Ireland. It's an idea that's come and gone over the years.
I can't remember if it was you that said it or if I read it on a website or something like that. That basically the traffic would be all one way. Yes, there would be some stuff coming back from Ireland. Or on the whole, everything would be going through to Ireland from, well, both Britain and continental Europe.
The compelling argument for the Channel Tunnel is not some romantic ideal of joining Britain to mainland Europe. It's because at one end you've got a major European city, and at the other end you've got a major European city. The two most important European cities, Paris and London, are A1 important. Connecting kind of the corner of Wales to Dublin. Okay, so if you were to build a high-speed railway all the way from London to Holyhead, that might make sense in a way, but the problem is at the other end of it is, this is going to sound terribly patronising in a British accent, the other end is Dublin. And Dublin just isn't that big.
I'm sure it's a lovely city. I personally have never been.
Fantastic place. I owe my living to the place. But yeah, it's not the big important powerhouse that London
Paris is.
Paris are. The other argument is for a tunnel that would go from Scotland to Northern Ireland, and it's a shorter route. But then you've got the problem of you're landing in like quite an obscure bit of Scotland. Like that, that route there.
Yeah, you'd have to go quite a long way around to actually get to anywhere that's not obscure.
Well, that's always the problem with Stranraer as the connection to Northern Ireland, is that it's right the way on the edge of Scotland, and anybody coming from the English side has to go up and then round the corner. And
the other problem with either point in Ireland is the lack of trains once you get there, because famously the Irish pretty much got rid of their trains.
Well, I mean, there's the main lines between Dublin and Belfast. But they got rid of a big chunk of the network, didn't they? They did what we did in the 60s, but they did it in the 90s quite recently.
Bigger style as well.
Yeah. Well, they did that thing which I thought was the most spiteful thing, where they deliberately sold the land and built houses on the routes of the trains so they could never bring them back, which I imagine made the trucking lobby rather happy in Ireland. And the busing lobby. It's terrible. Of course, the other problem is, of course, the Irish have a different gauge.
Yes, they've got narrow gauge, or narrower, isn't it?
Is it? No, it's not. It's slightly broader, I think.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, but you know how the Irish, it's unique. You know how the Irish got that gauge, and it's my favourite railway story.
Okay.
I can't remember the name of the guy. He was kind of the engineer who was responsible for the construction of Irish railways originally. It was kind of in the era when there was the War of the Gauges, and he decided that what he would do was compromise. So he got all of the different gauge sizes. So the standard gauge we use, the Russian gauge, the meter gauge, broad gauge that Brunel was using, the 7-foot gauge or whatever it was, 7'6". Somebody will correct me. He took all of those numbers and then he took a strict arithmetical average.
Okay.
And and that became the Irish gauge.
Brilliant.
So this is the best of all worlds, because we've got a gauge which compromises everybody else's. It meant that the Irish Railways is totally unique.
Can you imagine that Chinese train having to go from China to change at the last minute? Change as it comes out. Well, would you change at Holyhead or would you change as you came out the other end?
Yeah, that's a good point, isn't it?
To Irish gauge.
Yeah. Oh, madness. Yeah, but I don't think I think anywhere else for like major railway projects like that off the UK, just they're non-starters. The other thing is about the depth as well, because going under the channel is quite shallow. I mean, they had geological problems during the build of the Channel Tunnel. There was cracking in the rocks, and they then had to come from the top and find the cracks and fill the cracks with grout or whatever. That was all quite innovative at the time. But going westward is much, much deeper.
Old news.
The legislation exists. Eurotunnel. Well, is it Eurotunnel or is it Transmanche Limited, which was the construction firm? They have the legal permission to build an automotive tunnel.
Oh, yes. Yeah,
in parallel to the railway.
It won't happen now. Well, maybe with the advent of electric cars. But
Yeah, I was thinking
with
that.
the environmental lobby as it is at the moment, I can't see a car tunnel being a starter at all.
Yeah. Well, why not just put your car on the train on the shuttle anyway?
Yeah. In the 80s and the 90s, people were less bothered, less concerned about cars travelling long distances.
I don't know how you deal with the fumes with a tunnel like that. I mean, there is like the long tunnels in the Alps and things that they do deal with it, but I imagine it being rather unpleasant.
Old news, old news, old news.
That was the Channel Tunnel. As always, we owe a thanks to bensound.com for providing royalty-free music for our theme tunes, and also Mr. Peter Kitson for the use of his voice. Very good it is too.
Thanks for listening. Goodbye.